So let's talk about some of the news that we've seen in just the last 24 hours. The mayor announcing his suggestions for police reform. First of all, I'll run those down for you. The mayor saying that he wants to do an immediate investment of $5 million, Sacramento City dollars, general fund dollars, into new city department for non-law enforcement responses to 911 calls not related to criminal activity. Your reaction?
Yeah, I completely agree that we as law enforcement and specifically the Sacramento Police Department respond to quite a few calls that I don't think, one, that we necessarily should be responding to, and definitely not the people that are probably what our community needs on those calls or would be best served on those calls. And I think there's people with training and background that are better served for calls like some of the mental health calls we go on, not all of them, but some of them, and a lot of the homeless related calls we go on could probably be better served by people that are connected to resources and have a social work background or something like that.
What do you say, Chief, to those who say, well, who's determining what is a non-criminal call? You all know that you don't like to hear people say routine traffic stops because there's nothing routine about the work that you do. You might expect things to go one way, but then when you show up, things take a different turn.
Yeah, I think it's probably a misnomer to say non-criminal calls because there are a lot of calls that aren't necessarily criminal when they come in, but they are fairly volatile or have the potential for being volatile. So I'm thinking of calls such as, if you have a homeless call, we get a lot of calls about drug use amongst the homeless population. There might be a camp or somebody sees somebody shooting up with a needle. I don't know necessarily that a police officer has to go to that as opposed to somebody that can get help for that person, especially with the fact that most of the drug calls we go on now, if there is criminal enforcement, it's really a citation. So that person is still there. So, I mean, the main goal for us would be this person that has a drug problem is getting help for that drug problem, because if that gets solved, then the issues are pretty much eliminated.
What about domestic violence calls?
Well, domestic violence is our calls are definitely a criminal call. Our domestic violence laws are pretty strict and don't allow a lot of leeway for officers' discretion because of the volatility of domestic violence. So some of the more dangerous calls officers go on. So I wouldn't suspect if there's true domestic violence calls that some other person would respond to those.
But to that point, Chief, has there been much conversation with you? Talk to us about how this came about. Did the mayor reach out to you ahead of time to discuss this with you, or did you find out when we found out?
No, the mayor and I have talked. I imagine the mayor has reached out to a lot of different people and groups, including, I believe, organizations that deal with homelessness and mental health. He's been part of some of the mental health programs that we are part of with the teens and developing programs or ideas. How do we address mental health? So I'm sure he reached out to a lot of people, me being one of them. We've said for a while that there's a lot of things that we handle that don't necessarily need to be a police officer responding, but there's nobody else to respond. And there's nobody else for the community to call. So pretty much everything in our community and in society at large, if there isn't a specific organization that addresses that issue, people call the police department. It's like a catch-all. And so I think as a society, we can do much better in terms of getting the appropriate help and assistance to our community if we develop organizations or departments that could assist people in a much more holistic fashion than a police officer could.
Do you expect to be at the table, Chief, as again, as we talk about who's determining what these calls are? You know, is there a threshold for determining, okay, this is a police call, this is a non-police call?
Yeah, absolutely. I have no reason to believe that we wouldn't be at the table. Plus, I think we're still going to be involved in some form or fashion, at least at the beginning, because my guess is people will still call our dispatch center, and then they will refer to another department if it meets whatever criteria. That's probably going to be one of the more important things we do moving forward, is determining what calls would go to who, because you could put people in a dangerous situation if you send one of these other folks, like a social worker, to something that is a volatile situation. That could be danger. And it could also put the community in danger if we don't do this very carefully. But I absolutely believe are a significant portion of calls that we can do differently and respond to differently.
Then talk to me, Chief, about the second proposal, which was the creation of an inspector general with broad powers to fully and publicly investigate 3 instances of police brutality: any officer-involved shooting, any death while in police custody, and police use of force that results in serious bodily injury.
Yeah, as the Sacramento Police Department and as this community, we, I feel, have really proven over and over that we're not afraid of changing and afraid of looking at ways that we can build on the relationship. I mean, at the core of what ails us, in my opinion, is differences in race. And you don't change 400 plus years of something overnight. So it's a work in progress and we can always get better. We have a long ways to go. But this department has gone through a tremendous amount of change and willingness to look at things. We've invited Stanford in to examine our department, Center for Policing Equity, Department of Justice, all of those things, we invited them in to look at our department and provide us recommendations of how to get better. Over the last 2 or 3 years, we've implemented body cameras, the release of videos, reviewed and modified our use of force policy, created a research and development division. So, and the list goes on and on. So we're completely open to an inspector general and another person independently looking at our officer involved shootings. So I think whatever we're open to anything, and at least talking about it. We have an open mind about anything we think can make the relationship with our community better and expand experiences both of our officers and the community. And like I say, we need to overcome this thing that has ailed us since the inception of this country, being differences in race. And unless we address those sort of things, we're going to keep in this cycle that we continue to be in.
Well, your response to folks saying defund the police?
Yeah, I think that goes hand in hand with creating other ways of responding to certain calls. For me, in my opinion, in terms of defunding, if you did something like that to this department that resulted in positions being eliminated, I think that puts some of our most vulnerable more at risk and make them less safe. We are woefully understaffed right now. We have more than 100 officers less now than we had over 10 years ago. So I think each community has to determine whether that works for their community. But I think at the core of anything we do, we have to think about what's best for our neighborhoods, what's best for our community, and what is going to make them safe. And the reality, long-term wise, what makes our community safe is healthy folks in our community. So whatever helps create healthy folks that are able to chase their dreams in our communities is what, in my opinion, needs to be done. And right now, staffing wise, we are way lower than we used to be. And I think anything that would make that even less than it already is would be pose a significant safety risk to the communities that utilize our services the most.
And so I'm hearing you say, Chief, I don't want to put words in your mouth, you're suggesting that defunding the police would pose a safety risk to communities.
Well, it just depends. I mean, in terms of defunding, it's the devil's in the details in terms of what that means. But if it means reduction of police officers or professional staff in the department right now, the way we're situated, I think that would pose a safety risk for our communities.
You know, Chief, I know that during the protests, we had several folks who reached out saying that they felt that their rights were violated, people saying that they had bodily injury as a result of things like the rubber bullets, if you will. What's your take on re-examining the use of rubber bullets and tear gas on citizens?
Well, yeah, we will review the entire protest as all the reports come in and we're able to get all the videos in and look at them, and we'll do a full review of the entire week and a half of protests, specifically the first couple days that where those pieces of equipment were used when it was a little more volatile. And there's always room to improve, and there's always room to review what you have done to see if it can be done in a different way, in a better way. With that being said, over the last several years, this department has really built up our capacity with additional less lethal equipment, whether it be pepper balls or sponge round 40 millimeter launchers or shields or things like that, many of which were used at different points in this protest. We don't fire rubber bullets in this department, but there were specific times during this protest, had we not had some of those less lethal pieces of equipment, we would have had to use lethal force. And so one of the reasons why that has been built up over the last couple of years is not only in protests, but more commonly on regular calls, whether they're mental health calls or something else. These pieces of equipment get used pretty much on a weekly basis in this department that saves lives. So if we start taking some of those pieces of equipment away, then all we leave our officers with is their handgun or their rifle. And we don't want to leave our officers with one option, because that's all they have to either protect themselves or protect somebody else. Now, that doesn't mean that those pieces of equipment can't be used in a different form or fashion if we see that they were used inappropriately or in a way that we don't feel comfortable with. But I think just outright taking them away really limits the options that an officer has and limits them to lethal force, which is something I don't want to see.
You know, it wasn't that long ago, Chief, we were talking with you. I think it was LA that was doing some demonstrations with the, kind of reminds you of like a Batman tool where the thing wraps around your leg, you shoot it out and it wraps around. Is that something, you had mentioned that was something that you all were considering. Where are you with that?
Yeah, we're testing that now. We have been for the last several months. So when we get to the end of that, when we have enough incidents where it was utilized, we'll be able to determine whether we want to fully implement that throughout the department. But we're in that testing phase right now. It's been used a couple times in the department in the months that we've used it, and we want to get to a certain point where it's been used enough in enough different situations to determine whether we want to purchase more of those and equip all of our officers with it.
But at least it's something that's not being, that perhaps would be use less force, if you will, that's not going to cost someone their life.
Yeah, it's just what we've been doing for several years now, trying to find any pieces of equipment that can provide officers different options than using a gun. Like I said, even in the protests, there were life and death situations that officers were put in. Had they not had some of the less lethal equipment, they would have most likely had to use their firearm.
Things like what, Chief? Things like what? Things like what? Had they not had?
Had they not had pepper balls and shotgun beanbag rounds specifically, we would have, most likely the officers would have had to use their handgun.
Okay. Chief, I know that you were featured in a Washington Post article, the headline being Black Police Chiefs Express Anger and Dismay as they try to change their departments from within. Spend a bit of time talking about what you were hoping to get across in this article that got national attention.
Well, I think there's a group of folks throughout our country, specifically here in California, of a group of people that I talk to on a fairly regular basis, and that would be the Black police chiefs in California that are in a unique situation. We're not the only people in a unique situation, but in this particular case, a unique situation in that we all have, decades of experience for each one of us in law enforcement, but we're also Black men. And many of us grew up in our respective communities. I grew up here in Sacramento in Oak Park. And I think that provides a unique perspective on this issue that we're about race and in the Black community and how law enforcement is performed and the historical issue of race and differences in our community. Because law enforcement, we all need to recognize that law enforcement has a role in the unique history of this country, that anytime there is a law or policy or some rule that society or our lawmakers puts forward, the enforcement arm of that is law enforcement or the military in some cases. So we recognize that the history of law enforcement in our country is fraught with issues and challenges that still exist to this day. That we have carried on the historical issues that law enforcement has been involved in. And so I just think there's a unique point of view, and most of the chiefs that I know in that role are working in their departments to address biases and the race issue and the difference issue. And like I said earlier, that to me is what's at the core of what ails us. And law enforcement is at the center of that because of the power that we have, the power to take people's freedom away. And as we've seen, the power to take people's life away. And so it's something that we don't always talk about, but it's something that absolutely needs to be addressed in law enforcement specifically, but in society at large.
And Chief, I know we need to wrap up here, but I just will ask you, as we go forward, how would you describe the morale in the department? We've seen stories across the country of some officers walking off the job, given the nature of some of the experiences that they're having. Have you seen that here, and how is the morale?
Yeah, I can understand people walking off the job. It's a challenging time. And these protests have been extremely challenging in the sense that the protests are really protesting the relationship between law enforcement and the community, and specifically communities of color, and some of the horrific incidents like the one in Minnesota that occurred. And the people that are charged with ensuring the safety of both the protesters and the community at large are that very law enforcement that the protests are protesting and trying to get their feelings and opinions out. So that in and of itself is a challenging dynamic. But as we've seen in some of these protests, there's some of the more volatile, violent protests that we've ever seen, at least in Sacramento. And as we saw across the country, buildings burning, looting, murders, both of officers and protesters. So it's a challenging time. So I could see why people would say to themselves, maybe they want to do something else. But that being said, we haven't had any of that in the Sacramento Police Department. Doesn't mean we won't have some in the coming days and weeks. But in terms of morale, I would say it's as good as you could possibly expect under the circumstances. And then in addition to that, as you well know, Chris, is this week is the 1-year anniversary that we lost Tara. And so it's a very, very challenging week for this department, and an emotional week on top of the last several weeks of, pretty volatile protests where the officers were in their riot gear, having rocks and bricks thrown at them, and trying to ensure that we still protect the rights of protesters while we try to protect our businesses, people's lives, and our own partners' lives. I would say it's as good as can be expected, and it's extra challenging that this is a week that is the anniversary of losing Tara, and we're really focused on not only our community and the protests, but also the Sullivan family that lost their loved one, and our family that lost one of our officers.
One of the other things, and last question, Chief, the people, we've seen the $5 million coming from the general fund to create this new department. Some have said, though, what skin in the game does the police department have? Have you identified funds that you think would be able to go toward moving in this effort to kind of take some of the steam, if you will, out of this notion of defunding the police department? Maybe there are places that you can identify in your budget where you feel you might be able to reallocate some funds.
Yeah, I would say, to address your general question of what skin in the game the police department has, is the skin in the game we have is this is our community. We love this community. We don't want both our officers or our community to be in what we've been in over the last couple of weeks, over the last decades. We want to build a healthy relationship where everybody can thrive and everybody feels that this department, government in general, and society works the same for everybody, and that all families can thrive just as much as any other family. So the skin in the game that we have is we love this community, we love this city, and anytime this city is in either turmoil or distress, then we're in turmoil and distress. So the skin in the game is we want this to be the best possible city it can be. And right now we have our challenges, and we're going to work really hard to make sure that everybody can thrive as much as humanly possible in this city.
We thank you for making time for us, Chief. Hopefully we didn't hold you too long.